James had always dreamed of working for a prestigious company like Stratwell Industries. It was a multinational corporation known for its cutting-edge innovations and high standards. After months of job searching, he had finally landed a junior analyst position on the supply chain optimization team. The excitement of starting a new chapter in his career quickly faded, however, when he realized that his direct supervisor, Karen Phillips, was not the kind of leader who nurtured new talent. Karen had a reputation in the office. She was sharp, experienced, and highly ambitious, but she was also ruthless. Many of her colleagues quietly resented her, but few dared to speak up. She had a way of making people feel small, whether through snide remarks, dismissive gestures, or outright belittling. Unfortunately for James, she had taken a particular interest in him, and not in a good way. From his first day, she had made it clear that she saw him as nothing more than a burden. "Listen, newbie," she had told him within hours of his arrival, "this is not a place where we hold hands and guide you through every little task. You either keep up or you get left behind." James, eager to prove himself, had kept his head down and worked hard, hoping she would eventually acknowledge his efforts. 3 months in, however, things had only gotten worse. Karen constantly nitpicked his work, often in front of their team. If he made even the smallest mistake, she would point it out with exaggerated exasperation. If he did something right, she found a way to downplay it. James had started to wonder if he had made a mistake accepting this job. He knew he was capable, but the relentless criticism was beginning to chip away at his confidence. That Friday morning, the team was scheduled to present their latest report in a high-level meeting. The CEO, Mr. Reynolds, would be present, along with other senior executives. It was a rare opportunity for the supply chain team to showcase their findings directly to the top decision-makers. James had worked tirelessly on a section of the report, analyzing inefficiencies in the company's distribution network. He had cross-referenced data from multiple sources, identified inconsistencies, and proposed a set of cost-saving measures. It was his most substantial contribution to date, and despite Karen's attitude, he was hopeful that his work would be well received. The meeting was held in the executive conference room on the top floor. The space was sleek and modern, with a long glass table surrounded by high-backed chairs. A massive screen on the wall displayed the company's logo, waiting to project the team's presentation. James arrived early, clutching his notes, his heart pounding slightly in anticipation. He found a seat near the end of the table, away from the direct line of sight of the senior executives, but close enough to participate when needed. Karen entered the room a few minutes later, dressed in her usual sharp business attire. She barely acknowledged James as she took her seat at the head of the team's section of the table. Soon the room filled with executives, including Mr. Reynolds himself, a tall, composed man in his mid-50s with an air of quiet authority. He greeted everyone politely before sitting down and gesturing for the meeting to begin. Karen took the lead, smoothly presenting the team's findings. She highlighted broad trends and spoke confidently about the company's ongoing strategies. James listened intently, waiting for his section to come up. When Karen finally transitioned to the distribution inefficiencies, she turned to James with a neutral expression. "James put together the analysis for this part," she said flatly. "James, why don't you walk us through it?" James nodded, took a breath, and began explaining his findings. He spoke clearly, detailing the issues he had uncovered and the cost-saving solutions he proposed. He could feel the attention of the room shifting toward him, and for a brief moment, he felt like he belonged there. But then, just as he finished his explanation, Karen let out a short, sharp laugh. "Wow," she said, shaking her head, "that was something." The room went silent. James felt his stomach drop. Karen leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "I mean, really, James, these are basic observations. This is the kind of surface-level analysis I'd expect from an intern, not a full-time employee. Did you even double-check your numbers, or did you just throw some data together and hope for the best?" A few people exchanged glances. James felt his face heat up. He opened his mouth to respond, but Karen wasn't finished. "I swear," she continued with a scoff, Sometimes I wonder if you're even paying attention when we discuss real analytics. Or maybe you're just another brainless newbie who thinks he can coast by on half-baked reports." James felt like he had been punched in the gut. He knew Karen was tough, but this, in front of the CEO and senior executives, it was beyond humiliating. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Was this a test? A power move? Whatever it was, it had completely blindsided him. He looked down at his notes, unsure of what to say. The silence in the room stretched uncomfortably. He could feel the weight of every executive's gaze on him. He wanted to defend himself, to push back, to explain that he had spent hours verifying his findings, but the shock of Karen's public takedown left him frozen. And then, just when James thought the moment couldn't get any worse, Mr. Reynolds shifted in his chair. "That's enough, Karen," he said calmly. The entire room turned to look at him. His voice hadn't been loud, but the authority behind it was unmistakable. Karen's smirk faltered slightly, as if she hadn't expected any pushback. Mr. Reynolds picked up a printed copy of the report and flipped through it, his eyes scanning the pages. The room remained silent as he read. James barely dared to breathe. Finally, the CEO looked up. His expression was unreadable, but his next words sent a shockwave through the room. "Actually, this analysis is insightful," he said, tapping a page with his index finger. "He found inefficiencies that others missed." Karen's face stiffened. Mr. Reynolds turned to James. "How did you catch this?" James, still shaken, hesitated for only a second before gathering his thoughts. "I cross-referenced our supplier data with real-time logistics reports," he said carefully. "The discrepancies stood out, so I ran a secondary analysis and found the inefficiencies." Mr. Reynolds nodded. "Smart." He glanced at Karen. "Instead of tearing him down, you might want to listen to him." A ripple of quiet murmurs passed through the room. Karen sat rigidly, clearly caught off guard. James could hardly believe what had just happened. Moments ago, he had been humiliated in front of the most powerful people in the company. Now, the CEO himself had not only defended him, but also praised his work. It was the last thing Karen had expected, and judging by her expression, the last thing she wanted. But James wasn't thinking about Karen anymore. He was thinking about something far more important. Maybe, just maybe, he belonged here after all. Mr. Reynolds' words hung in the air like an unexpected thunderclap, reverberating through the room with a quiet power that no one had anticipated. The tension that had thickened the atmosphere just moments ago now shifted into something else entirely. Curiosity, perhaps, or a silent reckoning. James, who had been bracing himself for further humiliation, struggled to process what had just happened. The impact of being already ahead with Cordelia Burton Crawley. Had the CEO really just defended him? Karen's posture stiffened, her usually unwavering confidence faltering for the briefest of moments. She had clearly expected Mr. Reynolds to either ignore her comments or perhaps even agree with her assessment of James' work, but instead, he had not only shut her down, but had also gone as far as to praise James' analysis. James swallowed, trying to steady himself. He wasn't sure if he should say anything, but the CEO was still looking at him expectantly. "How did you catch this?" Mr. Reynolds repeated, tapping the printed report with his finger. James forced himself to focus. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice even despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. "I cross-referenced the supplier cost reports with the logistics data from the past 2 fiscal quarters," he explained carefully. "I noticed some discrepancies in the transportation expenses. Certain vendors were billing at rates that didn't match our contracts. At first, I thought it was just a data entry issue, but when I dug deeper, I found a pattern. Some of these overages had been slipping through for months." Mr. Reynolds flipped through the report again, his brow furrowing slightly. He turned to one of the senior executives seated beside him, a woman named Linda Chang, who was the company's VP of Operations. "Did we have anyone looking into this?" he asked. Linda shook her head. Not in this detail, she admitted. We've been focusing more on broader cost-cutting strategies, but we hadn't drilled down to these specific anomalies. She glanced at James with a look of genuine interest. This is actually a sharp catch. James felt a flicker of relief. Finally, someone in senior leadership saw value in his work. But he wasn't out of the woods yet. Karen, sensing that the conversation was slipping away from her, leaned forward with a forced smile. "With all due respect, sir," she said, addressing Mr. Reynolds directly, "James' findings are interesting, but they're still preliminary. We haven't fully verified these numbers, and—" Mr. Reynolds held up a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. "That's not what you said a moment ago, Karen," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You dismissed his work entirely." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Karen's expression remained composed, but James could see the slight tension in her jaw. Mr. Reynolds continued, "If this data is accurate, and from what I'm seeing it looks well supplemented, then James just uncovered a problem that could be costing us hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. That's not something to brush off." Karen forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "Of course, sir. I just meant that we should validate everything before jumping to conclusions." "I agree," Mr. Reynolds said smoothly. "And that's why I'd like James to work with the operations team to verify these findings in more detail." James blinked. Did he just say? Karen stiffened. "Sir, I can assure you that my team can handle—" "I'm sure they can," Mr. Reynolds said, his tone even. "But I want James directly involved. He found the issue. He should be part of the solution." Karen opened her mouth as if to argue, but something in Mr. Reynolds' gaze made her think better of it. Instead, she simply nodded, though James could tell she was seething. James, for his part, was still trying to wrap his head around what was happening. 3 minutes ago, he had been the target of a public humiliation. Now, he was being assigned to work directly with the operations team, an opportunity he never would have expected. Mr. Reynolds glanced around the table. "Anything else on this section?" The executives exchanged brief looks, but no one spoke up. After a beat, Linda Chang nodded. "No, sir. I'd like to review the details further with James after this meeting, but otherwise, we can move on." Mr. Reynolds nodded. "Good. Let's continue." The rest of the meeting moved forward, but James could hardly focus. His mind was still reeling from everything that had just transpired. Karen barely spoke for the remainder of the presentation, and when she did, her voice lacked its usual sharpness. James could tell she was furious, though she was doing her best to hide it. When the meeting finally concluded, the executives filed out of the room, murmuring amongst themselves. James hesitated, unsure of whether he should follow them or wait for Karen's inevitable backlash. Before he could decide, Mr. Reynolds approached him. "You did good work, James," he said simply. James straightened. "Thank you, sir." "Meet with Linda this afternoon," Mr. Reynolds continued. "Go over the details of your findings. I want a full verification by next week." James nodded, still trying to process how quickly things had turned around. "I'll be ready." Mr. Reynolds gave him a brief nod before heading for the door. James let out a slow breath, feeling both exhilarated and overwhelmed. He barely had a moment to savor the small victory before Karen turned to him, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes cold. "You got lucky today," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "Don't let it go to your head." James met her gaze. For the first time since joining the company, he felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just some nervous newbie anymore, desperate for approval. He had been acknowledged by the CEO himself. And that meant Karen's intimidation tactics didn't hold the same power over him as they once did. "I'll let the data speak for itself," he replied calmly. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing more. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked out of the conference room, leaving James standing there, still gripping his notes, a strange mixture of relief and anticipation settling in his chest. For the first time in 3 months, He felt like he had a real shot at proving himself, and he wasn't about to waste it. James sat at his desk, staring at his screen, still trying to process everything that had happened in the conference room. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Karen and the unexpected praise from Mr. Reynolds had not yet faded. He could still hear the CEO's words echoing in his mind. Instead of tearing him down, you might want to listen to him. It was a validation he hadn't expected, not so soon into his career. He had spent months feeling like an outsider, questioning whether he was truly cut out for this job. And yet, with just one presentation, everything had changed. His work had been recognized, and more importantly, he had been given an opportunity, one that he wasn't about to waste. As he pulled up his datasets to prepare for his meeting with Linda Chang, his email notification chimed. He clicked it open and saw the subject line, "Meeting today, Supply Chain Analysis." It was from Linda, confirming their discussion for later that afternoon. James took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair. This was his moment to prove that the numbers weren't just a lucky guess, that he actually knew what he was doing. But as he began rechecking his calculations, a shadow fell over his desk. He looked up to see Karen standing there, arms crossed. "You think you won something today?" she asked coolly. James hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "I think I did my job," he said evenly. Karen let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "Let me give you a piece of advice, newbie," she said. "You may have impressed Reynolds today, but that doesn't mean you're safe. He's a CEO. He looks at numbers, not people. If your so-called findings turn out to be inaccurate or impractical, you'll be out of here before you even realize what happened." James tightened his grip on his mouse but forced himself to remain calm. "I've double-checked my work. The data speaks for itself." Karen leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You don't get it, do you? You're stepping into waters you don't understand. You don't just go around making senior management look bad and expect there to be no consequences." James didn't flinch. If fixing a costly issue makes someone look bad, then maybe that's not my problem. Karen studied him for a moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away. James let out a slow breath. He knew that wouldn't be the last conversation he'd have with her. But he also knew that he couldn't afford to let her intimidate him anymore. Later that afternoon, James made his way to the operations department's conference room, where Linda Chang was already waiting. She had a reputation for being sharp, efficient, and no-nonsense, a stark contrast to Karen's more aggressive leadership style. "James," she greeted, gesturing for him to sit. "Let's get right to it." James nodded and opened his laptop, pulling up the data reports. Linda flipped through the printed version as he spoke. "I noticed that certain vendors were charging transportation fees that don't align with our contracts," he explained. "It wasn't an isolated incident. It's been happening in cycles, which means it wasn't just a one-time oversight." Linda studied the figures, her brow furrowing slightly. "Did you verify whether these overages were approved internally? Sometimes there are justified reasons for cost deviations." James nodded. "I checked. There were no additional approvals logged, and in some cases the invoices were processed automatically without proper oversight." Linda exhaled slowly, tapping her pen against the table. "That's a serious issue." James hesitated before adding, "I also found something else. Some of the vendors with higher-than-expected costs have ties to specific regional managers. I ran a correlation, and the pattern suggests possible favoritism, or even deliberate mismanagement." Linda's head snapped up. "You're saying this could be more than just an accounting oversight?" James swallowed. "I can't say for sure, but the numbers suggest that it's worth looking into." Linda sat back in her chair, staring at the screen for a long moment. "This is bigger than I thought," she murmured. Then she met James's gaze. "You did good work here." James felt a flicker of pride but kept his expression neutral. Thank you. Linda nodded, then closed the report. I'll need to present this to Mr. Reynolds. And we're going to have to do this carefully. If there's actual misconduct involved, it needs to be handled the right way. James nodded. Understood. Linda leaned forward slightly. I also want you to keep digging. Quietly. If there's more to this, I want to know before we take action. James hesitated, then nodded. I can do that. Linda stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Keep me updated. And James, she paused, giving him a small, approving nod. Don't let anyone make you doubt your work. James left the meeting feeling both energized and slightly anxious. This was no longer just about data analysis. It was turning into something much bigger. And if Karen had been annoyed before, she was going to be furious now. James walked out of the meeting with Linda, his mind racing. What had started as a simple data analysis had turned into something much bigger. Potential misconduct, financial mismanagement, and now a direct line to the CEO's office. He had expected pushback, but the reality of what he had uncovered made the situation far more delicate. If he wasn't careful, this could easily turn from a professional win into an office battlefield. He returned to his desk, still replaying Linda's words in his mind. Keep digging. Quietly. He knew what that meant. If what he found pointed to intentional misconduct, someone, maybe multiple people, was benefiting from it. And if they realized they were being exposed, they wouldn't take it lightly. Just as he opened his laptop to continue reviewing the numbers, his phone buzzed. A new email. Subject, urgent. It was from Karen. James exhaled slowly before opening it. James, my office, now. There was no explanation, no pleasantries, just a demand. James considered ignoring it, but he knew that wasn't an option. If he didn't go, Karen would escalate things in some other way. So, with measured steps, he made his way to her office. When he walked in, Karen was seated behind her desk, arms crossed. Her office was pristine, decorated in neutral tones with minimal personal touches. The large windows behind her overlooked the city, but today her sharp gaze was fixed solely on James. Close the door, she said. James did as instructed, then stood his ground, waiting. Karen leaned forward, her fingers tapping lightly against the desk. Do you have any idea what you're doing? She asked, her voice low but intense. James met her gaze. I'm doing my job. Karen scoffed. Your job? Your job is to support this team, not to go digging into things you don't understand. James kept his expression neutral. If by things I don't understand you mean financial discrepancies that are costing the company hundreds of thousands of dollars, then I'd say I understand them just fine. Karen's jaw tightened. You think this is some big victory for you? That Reynolds is going to make you a hero? She shook her head. Let me give you a reality check, newbie. This company doesn't reward people who stir up problems. It rewards people who know how to play the game. James didn't flinch. Is that what you've been doing? Playing the game? Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. For a second he thought she might deny it outright, but instead she sighed and leaned back in her chair. Look, she said, her voice lowering, you don't know the full picture. There are reasons why things are done the way they are. You don't get to walk in here after 3 months and act like you have it all figured out. James studied her, noting the way she avoided directly addressing the issue. She wasn't denying that there were irregularities. She was just trying to justify them. If there's a reasonable explanation for these numbers, I'm all ears, James said, keeping his tone calm. Karen's eyes darkened. Drop it. James didn't move. I can't do that. For a long moment the room was silent. Then Karen leaned forward again, her expression unreadable. Let me be very clear, she said. You have no idea whose toes you're stepping on. If you keep pushing this, you're going to regret it. James felt his pulse quicken, but he refused to look away. Are you threatening me? Karen smirked, but there was no humor in it. I'm giving you advice. James took a slow breath. Then here's mine. If you really believe there's nothing wrong with what's happening, you shouldn't be worried about my report. Karen's eyes flickered with something, anger maybe, or something deeper, like fear. Then, just as quickly, her expression hardened again. "This conversation is over," she said. James didn't argue. He turned and walked out, leaving Karen sitting in silence. That evening, James stayed late in the office, combing through the data again. He didn't want to make a mistake. If he was going to push forward with this, he needed to be absolutely certain. At 9:47 p.m., his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Watch your back." James stared at the screen, his stomach twisting. He wasn't naive. He had expected resistance. But this was different. Someone didn't just want him to stop. They wanted to scare him. He looked around the empty office, suddenly hyper-aware of how quiet it was. The weight of what he was dealing with fully sank in. But fear wasn't going to stop him. He took a screenshot of the message, then forwarded it to Linda Chang with a simple message. "We need to talk." The next morning, James met with Linda and Mr. Reynolds in a private conference room. He laid out everything: the discrepancies, the patterns, the possible connections between certain managers and overinflated costs. And then he showed them the text message. Mr. Reynolds sat in silence for a long time after James finished. Then he turned to Linda. "What do you think?" Linda exhaled. "I think James just uncovered something we can't ignore." Mr. Reynolds nodded. "I agree." He looked at James. "I'll handle the internal investigation from here, but I want you to keep doing your work as usual. If anyone gives you trouble, you come directly to me." James felt a weight lift from his chest. "Understood." Mr. Reynolds stood. "And James?" He offered a rare smile. "Good job." Over the next few weeks, the investigation unfolded quietly but effectively. The numbers didn't lie. Evidence surfaced that certain regional managers had been approving inflated vendor costs in exchange for personal incentives. The misconduct wasn't just an oversight. It was deliberate. By the end of the month, several people were either forced to resign or fired outright. Among them, Karen Phillips. James wasn't there when security escorted her out, but he heard about it. And he knew she would have rather faced anything else than the humiliation of being removed from the very company she had once controlled so effortlessly. As for James, his career didn't just survive the ordeal, it thrived. He was given a key role in the new compliance oversight initiative, ensuring that no similar discrepancies would be overlooked in the future. He had earned not only the respect of his colleagues, but the trust of the executive team. One afternoon, as he packed up for the day, he received an email. From Mr. Reynolds. Subject: Next steps. "James, I'd like to discuss a new opportunity for you. Stop by my office tomorrow." James smiled. 3 months ago, he had been just another brainless newbie. Now, he was someone who made a difference. And this was just the beginning.